Hi everyone, it's Kelly here. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time, welcome back if you've been before. Lovely to have you either way. On this channel we talk books, and today I am recording a wrap-up, a little bit late, but I am wrapping it up nonetheless, the month of October, which was a fantastic reading month for me. I finished 9 books. 2 of them were short stories, but the rest were regular sized books. Anyway, let me tell you about them. let's launch straight in, shall we? Okay, beginning with a book that I finished quite early on in the month of October. So it's actually been, I'm recording this mid-November, so it has already been some time since I read this one. But it is one that I was reading over a long period of time too. It's the book of Margery Kemp, obviously by Margery Kemp, and I read the translation by Anthony Bale. It's the Oxford World Classic. Oxford World's Classics edition. The call number for this book, I have it as 248.2092. This is a book that I heard about and was very interested to read because it is the first known autobiography, I believe, that we know of in the English language. So it was exciting to me to read this for the kind of perspective and to kind of know what life was like for people in those times. It is written by a woman called Margery Kemp, who was a mystic. She lived circa 1430. Oh, sorry. This book was written circa 1436 to 1438. So it's a very, very old book, but it was so interesting to kind of learn about what life was like, what the way that people thought, the way that people lived, and particularly for her because she did a lot of interesting things like traveling to Jerusalem and into other parts of Europe to see holy sites. So that was quite interesting also. I will say this woman does a lot of crying, like a lot of crying. So if you're not interested in reading about somebody crying incessantly in a way that irritates other people, then this book may not be for you. Yeah, so it is quite an archaic text too, so it's written in a very old-fashioned style, despite the fact that it is translated from an older form of English, obviously. But yeah, so she's a Christian mystic, so there's a lot of stuff in here about religion. But in the early parts of the book in particular, she's sort of talking about her life before she became a mystic and before she went into religion. So you really get an interesting picture of this woman's life. So that is quite interesting. So yeah, it was a bit of a hard-going read. It was made much more tolerable because I was buddy reading it with Elizabeth from Elizabeth Morgan channel. I'll link her channel down in the description below. And yeah, so we were chatting back and forth about this book, and that made it far more interesting. She's already wrapped up this book because she finished it a lot earlier than I did. So I will link to her video where she gives her wrap up of the book as well, so you can get her thoughts on it too. So I gave this 3 stars. It's kind of hard to give a rating to an archaic text because realistically it's, you know, it's written in such a different time, certainly a time before we gave star ratings to books, but just, yeah, in this case I decided to give it a rating. It was just okay to read, but I am really glad that I read it because it is something that has given me insight that I wouldn't otherwise have had. So yeah, very grateful to have had a chance to read it. Okay, the next book that I read was the first of the 2 short stories that I mentioned in my intro. It was Come See the Living Dryad by Theodora Goss. So Theodora Goss is an author who I've read a few books from before and really, really enjoyed. So I thought I'd give her short stories a try. So I'm going to talk in a moment about another Theodora Goss short story that I also read. So for Come See the Living Dryad, this is, it was quite a fascinating concept. So it is about a woman who is investigating the death of her great-grandmother, who was billed as the living Dryad in 1800s London by her husband, who called himself a professor, but is no such thing really. So this woman and her great-grandmother both have a rare medical condition that causes something akin to bark to grow on their skin. I really, as I was reading this book, wanted it to be longer, so I wished that it was not a short story. Maybe more a novella type of length would have been great, because I wanted more. So yeah, I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, and really I think it was because as a short story it needed to be not a short story. I think that was the bulk of the issue. It's getting through far too much in the kind of depth that I would expect from Theodora Goss, but yeah, the format wasn't quite right for the story, so that's why it's a 3.5. The next short story that I read from her was called Red as Blood and White as Bone, same author. This one, perfect format, and it's 5 stars from me. So this one is all about a young kitchen girl who discovers, and she works in a castle, and she discovers this ragged woman outside the door to the kitchen and lets her into the castle. And she's sort of fueled by fairy tales and these sort of this belief that this woman is a princess in disguise. This is a delectable short story. I highly recommend it. It was really, really interesting, and it really showcased Theodora Goss's capacity as a storyteller. I loved it. 5 stars. Okay, moving back to regular size books. The next book that I read was this one, Compulsion by Kate Scott. Now, I read this book, I decided to read this book by compulsion because I read it as an audiobook, and it was narrated by the same narrator who narrated a book that I had loved. Do I have it here? Yes, I do. It is, excuse me, lamp in the way. It is this one, Girl in a Pink Dress by Kylie Needham. And have I written down the name? Ooh, holding too many things. Bear with me for one moment. Yes, so the audiobook narrator her name is Airlie Dodds. She's an actress in Australia, and she did a fantastic job narrating this book. It was a very pleasurable experience, and I've spoken about this one a couple of wrap-ups ago. So I immediately went and looked to see if she had done any other audiobooks, because just listening to her as an audiobook narrator was such a good experience. I found that she narrated this book that I had never heard of, so I immediately put it on reservation with my library, and then subsequently bought myself a copy of the book while waiting for the audiobook to come in. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work, I felt, as well as Girl in the Pink Dress. Completely different authors as well. So, you know, it's nothing to do with the storyteller, the audiobook narrator, and everything to do with the writing. So for this one, if you're what I've written in my diary, my journal is, if you're into listening to wasted pseudo-intellectuals wax lyrical about their oh-so-important views on music, and if you like endless lists of things in lieu of plot or description, then this is the book for you. Yeah, this just didn't work for me as a novel, and I think it was more to do with the writing style. Yeah, like, it just, from my memory of it, it just kind of felt like just lists of things. Like, instead of sort of saying, I'm just flicking through the book to find an example. Yeah, so an example of what I'm talking about when I say it's just got lists, and this happens all the time through this entire book. It's just lists upon lists upon lists. So this is a quote from page 87 to 88. I fell through disused factories, vacant apartment blocks, rusted gilt plazas, burnt-out museums, shipwrecks and floodplains. I fell through abandoned tract estates, abandoned phone booths, abandoned swimming pools and abandoned train stations. I fell into caverns, into caverns, into caverns, deeper and darker and aromatic of earth. First caverns of hollowed-out hedonism, disordered noise, piano bar paranoia. Caverns lined with dusty amber bottles. Then I fell into the good ones, the caverns of opalescent stalactites, bluebells and croquet courts, fruit and fish, malachite and marcasite, mandolins and harpsichords, the caverns of spangly lilac pools. So that is an example, but it happened over and over again in this book, and it just sort of felt like those lists of interesting sounding words were really in lieu of plot, and in lieu of thought. So it just, for me, ended up being disappointing. And I guess I had built it up in my own head too, so there's an element of it that's me. But yeah, definitely this wasn't for me in the same way that Girl in the Pink Dress was definitely for me. So I ended up giving it 3 stars, but I feel that was potentially a generous rating. I'll leave it as is, but yeah, it just unfortunately didn't work for me. And I do enjoy a book that is vibes, so it isn't because it's a vibes only book. It is because it was pretentious at the same time, which is unfortunate. So that was that one. Not such a great read. Moving on to one that I gave the same rating to, but did work a little bit better for me as a book. Just, it was a bit too long. And that is Madly Deeply, the Alan Rickman Diaries, which were edited by Alan Taylor. The call number for this book is 791.4302.809. This book I was also buddy reading, and this one I was buddy reading with Teacup the Storyteller, Beki, and I will link to her channel down in my description below as well. She decided to abandon this book, or at least for now abandon it, because she was struggling with it. I pushed through. I also was struggling with it, particularly at the beginning. One of the things that is problematic about this book is that the editor, at the beginning, the first time a person is mentioned, because obviously this is Alan Rickman's diaries, which were not necessarily intended to be published for other people. So he mentions a lot of people that are either just people that are in his life, so not famous people, and then also a lot of actors and people working in theatre and the film industry who I've never heard of before, which is not a problem, except that the editor only tells you who they are the first time that they're mentioned in the diary. So if they are a person who comes back again at another point in the diary, that he just leaves it as their first name or whatever it is. And it makes it really, really hard to kind of get into and follow, because you're like, who is this person? I know I'm supposed to remember who this is, or know who this is, but I don't know who this is. So it made it really hard to kind of follow the threads of what was going on and who was around him at various points in his life. The other thing that was slightly problematic about it, and I don't know what his intentions were, as I said, I don't think that he necessarily wanted, was choosing for his diaries to be published. And of course they were published after he passed away, sadly, with the full permission of his wife and family. But I just had this real sense, and I don't know, I've never read someone's diaries before that were published in this way, but I just sort of had this sense of like, this feels like a private thought that he may not have he may not have wanted to be out in the world. So it was really kind of, as I was reading through it, just sort of hard to not feel like I was prying into his private life, which essentially I was doing. But yeah, it was definitely an interesting read. It was something that that I am glad to have read and to sort of have more insight into who he was as a person and the complexity of his character. Yeah, that was definitely an interesting aspect of reading this book. Yeah. I just didn't know a lot of the people that he was name dropping. So yeah, it made it a little bit tricky to kind of follow the threads. But yeah, I gave it 3 stars. It was just okay as a read, and it is very, very long. If you are someone who's part of that world, I can imagine that this would be, especially if you were someone that knew him personally, I can imagine that this would be a really, you know, a cathartic read, even just to sort of know that, you know, who he sort of cared about and was thinking about, and was having interactions with, positive and negative. Yeah, there's some juicy gossip in here. I'm not going to share it. If you want to know, you've got to read it. But yeah, it is what it is. I finished it. I pushed through and I finished it. And I'm proud of myself for doing that. Okay, moving on now to a book that was adorable. And that is Runt by Craig Silvey. Illustrated by Sarah Acton or Sarah Acton. I'm never sure when I see S-A-R-A if it's a Sarah or a Sarah, so I apologise to Ms. Acton for my assumed pronunciation of her name. So yes, Runt is a book that has won a lot of awards here in Australia. There's a lot of people talking about it. I believe at the moment they're filming a film version of this book, and I'm glad, because I think it will work really well as a film, and I think kids will really love it. It's a children's book, a middle grade, and it is all about a little girl who has this dog who they've sort of found each other there. She's a bit of an odd bod, and this dog is a stray who has been bothering everybody in their small town, but sort of has drawn to the little girl Annie, and yeah, has, you know, they've sort of become best friends, I guess. And the dog Runt will only listen to Annie, and will only follow what Annie tells Runt to do, but only when no one else is looking. So there's this sort of other plot that's going on in the book where, or sort of like the driving force of the book, I suppose, is there is a baddie who is buying up the town. The town is currently in drought. It's a farming town. So, you know, people are going out of business. He's buying up their farms. He's sort of got monopoly on the water in the town, via dams and other ways of sort of hoarding water. So he is not allowing that water to flow into people's farms on purpose so that he can buy up their farms and then allow the water back through and make it profitable for himself. He's collecting the town is how it's described. So she wants to save the town. She believes she can do this by entering Runt into a dog agility type of competition, and she sort of goes through the various levels of that, a sort of local to a countrywide to a international competition, if you will. Yeah, so it's a delightful story. It's very sweet. Annie is adorable. She's a lovely character. Runt is very sweet also. I would say most of the characters in this book are caricatures, but it is otherwise a very, you know, delightfully heartwarming story. I did have a cry towards the end, and I also, yeah, but I did find that I didn't find the story to be super believable, and things tended to like align very conveniently. So yeah, it wasn't a 5-star from me. Which I did think this one might be, given how many awards it's won. But yeah, there were just a few things that kind of pulled me out of the story a little bit, which is a shame. And anyway, it was still cute. I really liked it. I gave it 4.25 stars. So yeah, would highly recommend that you read Runt if you can get your hands on it. And I'll be looking forward to seeing what the film version of it is when it comes out eventually. So yeah, that was that one. The next one I picked up was a library book, and it is a graphic novel. Don't be super concerned here about this adult graphic novel sign. The library where I borrowed it from has this on all of the graphic novels that are intended for adults. I guess they just don't want kids to pick this up and go, oh, picture book, because it is written for adults, not children. But it is Law Olympus by Rachel Smythe. So I have been eyeing this one off. I've picked it up in bookshops a couple of times, you know, sort of thinking that it might be something I'd be into. I'm interested in gods and goddesses. They've been a hyper focus of mine in the past. Not so much now, but I still have a sort of vague interest in them. I liked the art style. I was like, you know, this could be for me. So anyway, I found a copy at the library, so I decided to borrow it and pick it up one afternoon. I read through it very quickly. This is volume 1. There are more volumes to come. I believe it started its life as a webcomic. So I will say it does feel very much like a webcomic. Like it feels like it's installments of a story. So yeah, if that's not something that interests you, then you might not enjoy this so much. But yeah, the art is gorgeous. The plot is interesting, but the storytelling is really choppy. So I think part of that is because of it would have come in installments as a webcomic. And despite the fast pacing, it felt like it was kind of taking a very long time to get anywhere. Because you know when you've got installments of things, it's like watching a TV show where you kind of leave things on a bit of a cliffhanger in the previous episode and then pick up in the next one. So just to kind of keep people moving along and wanting to come back for the next installment. So as a book, that didn't work so well, I felt. So yeah, I ended up giving this one 3 stars. I am glad I picked it up. I don't think I'm going to continue with the series. I'm glad I didn't buy the book, because yeah, I wouldn't be pleased I don't really want to own it. But yeah, I'm glad that I finally managed to pick it up. Okay, the next one that I read, so this is the second last book that I finished in the month of October, is Wifedom by Anna Funda. This is all about Mrs. Orwell's invisible life, and we are following Eileen, who married George Orwell, and for the most part, that's the most that most of us know about her as a person. So this is sort of looking at things from her perspective, because the previous biographies of George Orwell, and they're referenced in this book as well, did not have access to some letters that had come to light after the publishing of the most recent of the George Orwell biographies. So essentially, those letters shed light on the way that Mrs. Orwell, Eileen, thought about things and what it was like being married to George Orwell. And in short, it was not great. So yeah, you know, it was interesting. So essentially in this book, and I should say, sorry, this is non-fiction. The call number for this one is 820. In this book, the author is sort of doing 2 things. So she's kind of following the thread of the life of Eileen, and sort of how her life intersects with George Orwell, and, you know, essentially also the timeline of the publication of George Orwell's work, because she was incredibly involved in that. Essentially, she typed his work out for him and did a lot of the administration as well to get his books to publishers and so on. Also, lots of other things as well to protect his work. And also she was a writer in her own right as well, who kind of put her own life on hold, as was the thing that people did in that time, that women did in that time, to further her husband's career, her writing career. There is speculation that she was very much involved in the formulation of Animal Farm, which I think is, of the ones of his that I've read, is, I think, the best, and I think a lot of people agree that that is his best work. And there is a lot of talk about how the tone of that book is very different to other books of his, and a lot of people suggest that that may be the hand of Eileen, very much sort of helping him to develop the story via back and forth conversations, but also potentially having a hand in the writing as well. Yeah, so there's that aspect of the book, but the other aspect of the book is the author herself grappling with her own feelings about George Orwell, because she's a massive George Orwell fan, as well as grappling with her feelings about being a wife and what that entails, because essentially that is sort of the lens through which we're learning about the life of Eileen, is, and that's what we know from history, is her life as the wife of George Orwell. So it's very interesting in that way. It's sort of almost like two non-fiction books, one specifically talking about what it means to be a wife and what historically that has meant, and looking at what has and hasn't changed over time. And then also specifically as an example, looking at the life of Eileen, the wife of George Orwell. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I thought, well, enjoy might be the wrong word, but I found it intriguing. If you're a woman and you're reading this book, it will probably make you angry. I found myself feeling some feelings about the patriarchy in general, and about George Orwell specifically, and some of his very abhorrent behaviour, and things that felt acceptable to him that really were not acceptable. Yeah, I felt some strong feelings reading this book, but it is excellent. So I would recommend it. I gave it 5 stars, and I think it's something that will sit with me for a long time. So yeah, highly recommend Wifedom by Anna Funder. If you can get your hands on it, I would recommend. Okay, the last book that I finished in the month of October was unfortunately not a high. I should have finished on Wifedom. That would have been the high to finish the month off, but I was keen to get this book done and dusted. It's a book that I've been reading for far too long. It literally took me 6 months to read, and it has, I don't know, 122 pages. So, you know, a 122 page book shouldn't take you 6 months to read, but I was struggling through it, and I'll admit I did only finish it so that I could finish a prompt on my non-fiction reading challenge. The book is Be My Guest by Priya Basil. Reflections on food, community, and the meaning of generosity. I don't know about Priya Basil. I'd never heard of her. I believe she might be someone that might be known to British people, because that's where she lives. No, she doesn't live there. She lived in Germany. Anyway, I don't know. I got the impression from what she was talking about in the book that perhaps she might have some level of celebrity somewhere. But I didn't know who she was. So I wasn't reading this because it was a name that I knew, is what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to downplay her celebrity. I just don't know who she is. Anyway, this book is all about, as the subtitle suggests, food, community, generosity is sort of what it's about. It's about being hospitable. It's very full of hot takes, let me just put it that way. And sometimes those hot takes are really naive, and sometimes those hot takes really smack of privilege. Yeah, it felt, despite the fact that it does have an overarching theme, it didn't feel very connected. It's sort of in little, just sort of bite-sized sections. And it felt just like a collection of random thoughts that a person had. that are not particularly connected to each other. I didn't like it. I gave it 2 stars, despite the fact that the cover of it is absolutely stunning, and that is honestly what drew me to the book in the first place, was the cover. It ended up being disappointing, and is not a book that I would recommend. So that was a sad way to end what was a very good reading month for me. I had 2 5-star reads. Is that correct? Yes, because I had Red as Blood and White as Bone, the short story, that was a 5-star read, and then I had Wifedom, that was a 5-star read for me. So fantastic reading month, all things considered. But yeah, not a great ending, unfortunately. All right, so that is my wrap up of the month of October. Whoop! Do not pull the lamp down. Whoop! As you go. Don't try and pick up a big stack of books. Just, that's a hot tip from me. While you are filming, stop and do it, and then continue talking. That would be my recommendation. Okay, so that is the month of October, and I had a good time for the most part reading. Apologies that this has come so late. I've had a very, very busy beginning to November getting my reports done for school, so I am mostly through that now, and I'll be able to focus on producing more content for you. So that is my plan for November. We'll have some more videos coming up soon, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this wrap up, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye.